I remember all through my, medical training, I found myself falling into this, where did I rank in the class rankings? And then I would, start in my medical practice. And then when I got into ministry and looking at other people, what model can I follow? And I found myself regularly trying to make myself more like what they thought I should be. And it seems to me that's one of the places in my heart that comparison often tries to draw me to, is I'm not being who God made me to be. I'm trying to be what somebody else. Do you struggle with feeling like you're not good enough when you look at other people around you? Maybe they have more money, maybe they seem smarter or prettier. I'm Dr. Carol, and today we are talking about comparison. I think we all fall into the comparison trap. There is a scripture that I have had to remind myself of repeatedly, and it comes from 2 Corinthians. Not that we dare to classify or compare ourselves with some of those who are commending themselves, but when they measure themselves by one another and compare themselves with one another, they are without understanding. The King James says, they are not wise. It certainly isn't wise, but we find ourselves doing that all the time. My guest in this episode is Shannon Popkin. Shannon is a wife, a mother, an author, a speaker, a Bible teacher, helping people everywhere apply Jesus' story to their story. She loves storytelling. And we are going to be talking about comparison. Shannon recently has released a book, Comparison Girl, Lessons from Jesus on Me-Free Living in a Measure Up World. And as I have looked at this area and applied it to my own life, I can see so many areas where this speaks to me. Somebody else has, achieved a higher level in their medical career than me, or somebody else has a higher ranking as an author on Amazon than I, sold more books, or somebody else has more speaking engagements, or somebody else is taller or prettier, or has a larger ministry. I mean, you could go on and on and on. And on the other hand, when we see ourselves as better, we end up looking down on everybody else. Well, I know more than they do, or I'm smarter, my way is right, or I'm better at that. And just all of that, it's just messy. It's not the way of Jesus. It's not the way of the kingdom of God. So I want to share this conversation with my friend and fellow author, Shannon Popkin. Shannon Popkin, I am delighted to connect with you and have you as a guest on this episode today. We share a literary agent who helps us with publishing, and that's how we connected. It's just such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Dr. Carol. It's great to be with you.
Now, when I think about my books, I go to Amazon and I look at the rankings, and sometimes when I see another author, I'll go there and I'll look at the rankings. And I have to say, I looked at your rankings and you rank higher than me on Amazon.
Don't do it.
I'm illustrating something we're going to talk about today. Okay. Don't we all do that?
Yes. And I'll have you know that I have looked at many other authors who rank higher than me. So I don't know that there's anyone who outranks everybody except for the Bible. The Bible completely outranks everyone. And that's who we need to be lifting up anyway. So
Exactly. But let's just use that as a jumping off point to talk about your book, Comparison Girl, because I think we all fall into that trap of comparing, like I just illustrated, comparing my Amazon rankings with yours. Mm-hmm. So just kind of set up that idea about how comparison is such a trap.
Yes. I think it's just human nature to take our little measuring cup filled with whatever God gave us and put it next to somebody else's and look over and say, I wish I had what she has in her measuring cup. She has more of this, or to feel like, ooh, I have more of this in my cup. And I, feel superior about that. And it's a setup. It's a setup. It's not, it won't lead to anywhere good. And I think our enemy uses comparison against us. He has set up this world that is really focused on measuring, comparing, putting value statements on differences. And he uses that to divide us. And so he gets his way when we're either completely focused on ourselves saying, oh, I don't measure up, I feel icky about myself. Or when we're completely self-focused saying, oh, I do measure up. And look, she's beneath me. And either way, we pull away and we just continue to focus on ourselves. So it's a trap. I think it's intuitive. We know that comparison leads to self-destruction and it leads to divisions. It leads nowhere where any of us want to go. And yet we keep falling into the trap. So I'm thankful for the chance to talk about it and to talk about what Jesus has to say about comparison.
Absolutely. And that has to be where we go for answers to this. I remember all through my, medical training, I found myself falling into this, where did I rank in the class rankings? And then I would, start in my medical practice. And then when I got into ministry and looking at other people, what model can I follow? And I found myself regularly trying to make myself more like what they thought I should be. And it seems to me that's one of the places in my heart that comparison often tries to draw me to is I'm not being who God made me to be. I'm trying to be what somebody else thinks I should be. And that trap is just so self-destructive.
Yes. Yeah. I have a friend who actually is I think she would say a career counselor. I can't remember exactly her title, but for medical students. And she just, works with these students and there's so much anxiety and pressure as they're pitting themselves against each other. And they're really putting themselves on a destructive path. The more that they're focused on how they rank and how, what their career path holds. And I mean, the reality is some of them are cut out for more than others. Some of them actually do have more capacity level, more intellect, more giftedness, right? For certain parts of medicine, which is the same of every different discipline. Some of us do have more in our measuring cups than others. And I think the question is, can we live with that? Can we live in a world where God does give more to some than others? And really, can we live with God's sovereignty in that?
Yeah.
Just live with. And so for me, the journey has been really getting my eyes off myself and the value statements and the measurements. I call it that, looking at the lines on the side of the cup, right? So always putting my cup next to somebody else's and when I'm focused on the lines, I'm really focused on me. I'm asking how do I make it, like you said, we're trying to posture, we're trying to fill our cups, always trying to lift ourselves up and always looking at the lines. But really, that's so much self-focus. And there's so much freedom in saying, you know what, God may have given me less, but I'm not concerned about that. I'm really focusing on the spout. And I'm focused on taking what I have in my measuring cup and pouring my life out in whatever way God designed for me in particular to do, and in this season. Because as you know, Dr. Carol, as we age, right, our capacity level diminishes. And so this season, so a lot of us compare with ourselves 10 years ago, right? And so I just find such freedom in saying, okay, what's in my cup right now? And how can I pour it out? And how can I do so in a way that honors God and honors how He has made me? And there's just so much freedom, because look at when you tip your measuring cup, the lines don't really matter.
Yeah.
They're irrelevant. So there's just freedom in focusing our lives on the spout, which is what Jesus taught.
I love that. And just thinking that way, you can feel the freedom in your soul just bubble up. You've kind of alluded to it, but let me just ask you a little bit more. Where do you think all this comes from? I think of kids, when they're 2 or 3 or 4, they're just relishing in life. And if they have a modestly healthy, home, just delighting in parents delighting in them and whatever, and they're not particularly worried about, did somebody else get teeth before I did, or whatever.
Right. Yeah, they're not worried about whether they're potty trained better or quicker than their little buddy in the nursery. No, they don't worry about that. But then there is a time in life when our eyes kind of flutter open to differences, and we do start measuring against each other, right? So I see what you're getting at here, and I think that our enemy really capitalizes on that time when we start noticing differences, especially for middle schoolers.
Yes. Whoa.
Yes, like
not
girls.
A fun time for probably the majority of kids.
No. And I mean, I can remember in my life at that time, there's a story I tell about sixth grade camp and how I went into it, like you're describing, just this happy-go-lucky, ready to have fun kid. And then I found out that the girls in my cabin were talking about how it was much better to shower at night than in the morning. Dr. Carol, I have no idea what you would say about that hygiene-wise, but they were convinced it was better. And I don't remember their reason, but I was concerned because I was not planning to take a shower at all because this was camp. And I started like retreating into my corner and feeling like, oh no, I didn't know we were taking showers, and I didn't bring shampoo, and I didn't bring a towel. And I spent the whole time, rather than, having fun and doing all the things that camp was there for, I like held back in my cabin because of this silly shampoo thing, right? And that's just what we do, right? We retreat into our little corners, we pull back, and we don't offer ourselves to the world or what the world has to offer us. We retreat, and we're distracted, and our capacity for doing good is diminished because we're so self-conscious and we're so self-aware. And, I think our enemy loves it.
Yes.
I think when he watches us kind of retreating into our corner, or, the other way, coming out of our corner, like trying to make a big splash, whatever it is, he loves it when our focus is on us. There's some verses in James that say, if you have jealousy or selfish ambition in your heart, don't boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes from above, but this is this wisdom is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. So that word demonic really caught my attention. Like, this is Satan and his forces are inviting us to this jealousy, this looking over, oh, she has more in her cup and I don't like that. Or the other one was selfish ambition, like trying to prove I have more in my cup, right? And both of those are tied to an enemy who has set up a whole world system to get our eyes off of God and onto ourselves, and just fall into all of these traps. And in God's kingdom, it's completely different than this. One more thing, Dr. Carol, I'd love to say is when we look at Satan's story, we don't really have a narrative for his story, right. But what we know is that he was this created being in heaven, and he was not content. He wanted to be lifted higher, right? So he wanted to be elevated, and he was comparing himself to God. There's a verse in Isaiah that says that he wanted to be like God. He was comparing, and I mean, the audacity of a created being to compare himself with God and want to measure up, right, to God. And Jesus said that Satan fell like a flash of lightning. This pride in Satan was not tolerated. So Satan came to our earth somehow. We don't really understand all the details, but we know he's here. We know he brought a third of the angels with him, and we know that he still sees himself as God's rival. He's still measuring himself against God, and he still is trying to prove that he measures up. And what does he try to do to get at God? He comes after us. He tries to hurt us. And so he tries to pull us into the same narrative that he chose for himself, always measuring, always wanting to be lifted up. And so I guess we have to ask ourselves, am I going to live out that narrative? Am I going to live out this enemy's story? Or am I going to live like Jesus? Because what did Jesus do? Philippians 2 says that Jesus came not trying to prove his equality with God. He did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but instead he emptied himself. He took
himself out, the spout.
Yes, completely. Yeah, he focused his life on the spout. And so that's Jesus's narrative. Which one are we going to choose for ourselves? I think is the story that we have to, recognize that we're living in.
That is so sobering.
Mm-hmm.
And just to think of comparison falling into being like the enemy, that was his paradigm. And it makes me think, are we going to end up falling like lightning if we stay there? I think
Right.
that's a sober warning,
Yes.
that is not who we are to be patterning our life after. But like
Right.
you said, after Jesus, who poured himself out.
Yeah.
In your book, go ahead.
Our pride won't be any more tolerated than Satan's.
Yeah.
If that's how we're living our life, if we live our whole lives, even if we live our lives with a sense of inadequacy, always feeling less than and always measuring and always trying to fill ourselves and being jealous, like that is actually a life of pride. It's a me-focused life, and it won't be tolerated in heaven. The only life that is tolerated is a life that is modeled after Jesus, a life of humility, saying, you know what, God created me. He made me as I am. He designed me to empty myself out. That's the life that God wants for each of us to have, a life of freedom.
Yes. Powerful, powerful. In your book, Comparison Girl, you talk about 5 different areas where we tend to fall into these, comparison traps, and want to talk about, some of those. One being sin, and I can see myself here. On some levels, it's like, oh, I'm not sinning like that person is, so I'm not as bad as them,
Yeah.
or either myself or other people I talk to. This sin is keeping me struggling. I'm really struggling here. So I must be the worst, and God must not love me because I'm sinning. And so I'm worse than everybody else. It's that comparison thing.
Yes, it is. And, we have seen a lot of people disgusted with each other in the past year, haven't we?
Yes.
and it's not just disgusted with who we are. It's like how we think and how we do things, right? Just these different polarized camps and different ideals. And I think for the most part, this disgust is saying, like, you're doing it wrong. You're seeing it wrong. I'm right and you're wrong. And so, like, in the same sense, I don't think they would call it comparing sin, but right and wrong. I mean, that's what, that's how we describe sin, right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And, all of us are wrong. Like, we're all in the category where we're wrong. There is no one who is righteous. There's none righteous. No, not one, the Bible says. And so we are all in the same category. And I think all of these divisions in our country and in our world, they're meant to pit us apart, pit us against each other and divide us. And I think if we could just see ourselves all in the same category, we are all sinful. None of us has anything to lift ourselves up in the presence of God. And if we do, we've got a problem, right? And our disgust is actually us lifting ourselves up and looking down at someone else and saying, she's wrong. And we can't communicate disgust without looking down on somebody else.
That's right.
So, and I love the parable of the that Jesus tells about the Pharisee and the tax collector in the temple, because the Pharisee is over here and he's looking over at that guy. He's wrong. Look at here are all the ways that he's wrong and I'm right. And so there he is in God's presence in prayer, lifting himself up. And he has such a skewed perspective of himself, like in that moment.
But wasn't he saying things that were true? I mean,
yes,
he wasn't wrong.
He was not wrong. That's the irony. He was not wrong about his lists, but here's where he was wrong. In that moment, as he's elevating himself and looking down with disgust at that other person, that's where he's wrong. His self-righteousness and his self-dependence and his self-reliance, that's where he's wrong. And that's where we're wrong too. When we are looking at someone else and looking down upon their sin and not seeing ourselves as a sinner who cannot save ourselves, we needed Jesus. If we look at the cross from a medical perspective, right? That's a gruesome scene.
Totally. Yes.
And if we look at that and say, my sin is what made that necessary, like made that sacrifice necessary, there's they're at the foot of the cross. If anybody's trying to elevate themselves, they clearly don't have a good picture of who they are, who Jesus was, how he humbled himself, and what God calls us to. So yeah, comparing sin, either that comparing and feeling so inadequate and worthless, or feeling better because I haven't sinned as much as somebody else. I think both parties need to look at the cross, right? That's where our eyes need to be drawn to, because yes, our sin was bad, but look what Jesus did. And he didn't do that. He did not go to the cross that we might just feel worthless and, in agony. No, we look at the cross and say, thank you. Thank you for what you did for me.
At the foot of the cross, we are all equal. And that's where we need to be. It's where we need to stay.
Yeah. That's so true.
Money, one of the hardest things that we talk about, or that we don't talk about in our world, and yet so easy to compare. Money, wealth, that's a trap. Talk about that struggle.
It is, yeah. The reality is, again, that some of us, just like the sin thing, some of us are more sinful than others, right?
Yep.
Some of us have more money than others.
That's right.
I mean, it's a reality. And so we can look at that and compare and measure, or we can focus on the spout, right? So I think it's really important to recognize that God did not give some of us more so that we would feel superior to someone else, right? And God did not give some of us less that we might feel inferior to someone else. God he puts measuring cups that are mismatched side by side, because he wants to pull us together. He wants for those who have more to pour into those who have less. That takes humility. This takes humility. Pouring and receiving both take humility. But look at how that draws people together.
It does.
Look at how that
have to be together.
Yes. Yeah. And I don't know about you, Dr. Carol, but whenever I give, especially when I'm giving in a way that seems extravagant, it seems like, God, oh man, God, really that much, or that, that, like, this doesn't, when I give in a way that hurts, my heart is drawn to these people that I've given to. I'm not just blindly like throwing it over my shoulder, right? Whatever's in my measure. No, I'm taking the spout and I'm pouring it, and I'm looking at a particular person or a particular need, and I'm pouring into something that matters to God. And so, generous people reflect a generous God. And there's such freedom in tipping our cup. And, in America, I think I'm talking more about those who have more in their cup as Americans, because, we live with more surplus income than a lot of people in the world do. Right. And if any of us, haven't thought about the fact that we might be greedy with the extra that we've been given. Like, if we haven't really grappled with that, we're self-deceiving. Tim Keller says, nobody who's greedy thinks they're greedy. They just don't. He compares it and he says, if you're committing adultery, you pretty much know you're committing adultery. You don't look over at this person and say, oh, I didn't know you weren't my husband, right? You're committing adultery. But when you're committing this sin of greed, you don't really realize it. It's not, he says that in all of his years of ministry, he's had a lot of people coming and confessing a lot of things, but nobody has ever come to confess greed. And repeatedly, there are warnings about wealth, warnings about putting too much emphasis on what we have. And if those warnings are there, then I think that those of us who have surplus and our measuring cups need to take a very close look at our hearts and how our hearts are tied to our money. And if we want to be free, activate that spout and draw in and invest in others.
Reminds me of a conversation I had, it's been a few months ago now, with an international ministry leader. And he talked about going to some of the poor areas in the world. I believe in this case, it was Africa. He goes to lots of different places. And he was asking some of the local Christian leaders what they thought the biggest impediment to the spread of the gospel was in their region. And he was thinking it would be something like, the paganism and or the other religions that they had to fight against, or the extreme poverty and lack of resources. And these local leaders said they felt the biggest impediment to the spread of the gospel was materialism. And that has so struck me. and stayed with me. And it speaks to what you're talking about. It doesn't matter how much is in your cup. It doesn't matter where your line is in wealth or anything. It's what you do with it. Pouring it out.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. We met some missionaries from, I believe they were from Taiwan, and they were telling us how they had worked with the poorest of the poor, and how greed was such an issue in this poor community, and how, these people were so self-focused that it was really hard to reach them with the gospel because of their extreme, comparing and criticizing and greed and measuring, and all of these things were so distracting to them. And so I think that just goes to prove really exactly what you said. It does not matter how much or how little we have in our measuring cup. Really, we can look at our wealth the wrong way, no matter how much we have. We can always be focused on the lines. And in either case, we can choose to be generous. Yep. I love the story that Jesus tells of the widow who has the 2 copper coins, right? And don't you love the fact that she has 2? Because since she has 2, it means she could have kept 1, right? Yes. And that was for widows in that time. The temple, the allotted amount that the widow would receive was 2 copper coins each day to pay for her daily needs. So that was her bread money for the day. And so she apparently decided to fast and to give all that she had that day, out of a heart of generosity. And what I love is Jesus calls the disciples over and says, hey, look at her. Look at her. She has given more than all of these. So he's comparing, right? And he's calling, he is. And he's calling attention to the fact that, in my kingdom, things are different. They're upside down. Things don't measure the same way that in the world. The world is all about the lines. But in my kingdom, it doesn't matter how much we have. It's how giving we are with what we have. That's how we measure things in the kingdom. So Jesus just is noticing how, to such extravagance, she's tipping her measuring cup and pouring out all that she has, and trusting God with her future, and lifting up others, honoring, the human needs around her. And what a beautiful display of godliness. I just love that example.
Yeah, great. I love how you're bringing the examples of how Jesus uses comparison to undo what we normally think of in that way. I love that. You talk about how we can compare our physical skin deep beauty and our status in various settings. But I would love to spend a couple minutes talking about how we compare ministries. And this has been a matter of prayer for me personally, because, I feel like I know that God has given me, some things to say, some things to do, some ways to help people. And it's so easy to look at the numbers and compare with others. Oh, I've got, this many podcast downloads, and this many people on my email list, and this many clients, and this many speaking engagements. And that's not the way of Jesus.
Yes, we have more opportunities than ever before to get the message out, don't we? Yes. We have all of these little windows open to us, the window of email, and the window of, social media, and the window of a podcast, all of these different windows. But each of these windows is an opportunity to put our nose up to the window and look at what everybody else is doing, and measure and compare. And that's just what will get us distracted from the spout again, right? Yep. You and I could spend entire days, entire weeks feeling discouraged and frustrated because of the lines, right? And when I get all focused on that and looking at how I'm measuring up compared to someone else who's pouring out, right? Some other ministry partner, when I'm focused on the lines, I can't be focused on the spout at the same time. I can't be saying, well, Dr. Carol has a podcast and I don't have a podcast. I can't get all, I could get all tied up in knots and I wish I had this many followers. Well, I can't at the same time be asking, okay, Lord, what do you want me to do with this podcast this week? I think it's just so ironic that we get focused on measuring when the whole point is pouring. And I think our enemy uses that against us. There's a little story that Jesus tells about these vineyard workers. Do you know that story about how Jesus tells the story? So there's a way simpler way to tell that story, Carol. So the best way to tell it would be that one guy came to work at 5 p.m. He only worked an hour, and the master paid him a whole day's work. That would focus on generosity, right? And that's really what, Jesus is saying, our master is generous. But instead, Jesus tells the story that people are coming some come early in the morning, and some mid-morning, and then they're coming at all different times. And then they get paid. And there's this whole first will be last thing that is said throughout the story. And the last ones to start working get paid first. So there's a little interesting detail there. If the first had been paid first, we can kind of picture them being dismissed and not. So instead, the ones who've been there in the hot sun all day, they're looking on at the one who only worked an hour and gets paid a full day's wage. And their response to that is not fair. Mm-hmm. Like this is, and they say they're grumbling to the master, and they say, you have made them equal to us. So see that measuring word? You've made them equal. Exactly. And the assumption is they are not equal, because we have worked harder and longer. And I think those of us in ministry can look over at other people who have had some sort of ministry success in the eyes of the world, right? Yep. Their numbers are higher in some way, or even equal to ours. And we have worked harder and longer, and they don't deserve. And I think Jesus's response, what the master says in the parable is, can't I be generous to whom I want to be generous to? Like anything that we have to pour out in this vineyard has first been given to us. And God does sometimes give great success to unlikely people, and can we live with a God like that? Can we just put our eyes back and focus on this generous master who is inviting all of us to be part of the vineyard, but who wants to display his glory, not our glory. And he's not about measuring. He's not about like fairness and, you've worked the longest and you've worked the hardest, because what does that do to our hearts?
Right. Those
of us who have been around the church the longest and have worked the hardest tend to have also the most sense of entitlement.
Yes. The
pride.
Biggest struggle with exactly that. The biggest struggle with entitlement or self-righteousness or looking down on others. Totally. Exactly. Those who have been around the church the longest, that's their biggest struggle.
Yeah. And so I think God puts people in our path, to call this out in us. Like the whole story, Jesus built this whole story to call out this moment where one who's worked harder is looking at another who's worked less and saying, you've made them equal to me. I don't like that. And I mean, I don't know if you've had moments like that, Carol, but I definitely have had moments like that in ministry. I think God gives us these opportunities to check our hearts and say, wait a minute. I'm serving a God who is not about measuring up. He's not interested in that. And I also love, just to kind of balance that out, the parable of the talents, the guy who doubles 2 and the guy who doubles 5 talents, they're both given the same commendation from the master. Right. They're both told, well done, good and faithful servant. And so it really doesn't matter if we have more or we've produced more or we're, really what matters is if we take what we've been given in our cup, whatever capacity level, whatever opportunities, whatever platform, whatever gifts and talents, if we just take those and faithfully pour out what we've been given and, work within our capacity level, our gifting, and just faithfully serve our master, we get to hear, well done. And it won't matter to us. Those numbers won't matter. That little widow, when she gets to heaven, she's not going to say, well, I only gave 2 that day. I only had 2 to give. She's just going to delight in the fact that she honored the king and she gave what she had and she was faithful. Like that's because she's going to hear, well done, good and faithful servant.
Your measuring cup analogy, and I love that the visual as well as the mental picture of that, it does a couple other things too. We need to aim to end our life completely poured out, empty, not holding anything back. And we only can pour out what we have been given. Yes. We're not asked to pour out more than we have been given. Yeah. We're just asked to focus on that with whatever God does give us. It's so freeing in that way too.
It is so freeing. Yeah. Like I just picture myself trying to scoop up more and get it in my cup so that I can pour it out like that. No, that's not what God called me to. And to live with the fact that he put more in somebody else's cup, but we're both just assigned the same task to take what we've been given and be faithful with it. Whether it's money, whether it's ministry, whether it's our skin deep packaging, whether, really whatever it is, just to take the life, take the body, take the resources that we've been given and live to lift others up and to lift our God up by serving.
Love it. Comparison Girl, you have generously offered our viewers, listeners, a copy. We're going to let you know in just a moment about how you can request one. But Shannon, tell us about that for a minute.
Sure. Yeah. The subtitle is Lessons from Jesus on Me Free Living in a Measure Up World. And it's really taking Jesus's response to people who were comparing in these different categories and looking at, we've talked about several of these stories that he told or the conversations he had with people. And so we're looking, I just think it's really interesting that when people are comparing, Jesus doesn't say, don't compare. He says, he starts talking about the kingdom repeatedly. He talks about the kingdom and he's like, I think what he's saying is, yeah, I get it that here in the world, things do stack up a certain way, but in my kingdom, it's different. It's just completely different than the way you're looking at it. And if you can adopt my kingdom perspective, which is the last will be first, the greatest is the servant, but whoever humbles themselves will be exalted. If you can adopt that, that is a life well lived. And so that's really what Jesus is inviting us to all throughout the Gospels as we look into these conversations he has with people who are comparing. And so the book is really looking at what did Jesus teach? How did he respond? And it's a Bible study. It really is a Bible study for women.
Well, thank you, Shannon, for making a giveaway possible. And for you who are watching again, hold on for just a minute and we'll let you know how you can request one.
Yes. And
go ahead.
If I could just add one little thing, if you come to comparisongirl.com, we have all sorts of little things that you can download, freebies and stuff like that. So we love giving stuff away. We love pouring out into you.
And that was going to be my next question. Where do people find it? Comparisongirl.com.
Yes, that's where we can find it.
Great. Well, we'll make sure also that there are links under this video and in the show notes to the audio podcast. It has been a delight, Shannon, to have you with us today. And God bless you as you continue to pour out your spout.
Oh, it's been just a joy to speak with you, Dr. Carol, and thanks for all you're doing to invest all that you've been given for the sake of the kingdom.
I am so grateful that Shannon has agreed to make 2 copies of her book, Comparison Girl, Lessons from Jesus on a Me-Free Living in a Measure Up World. She's made 2 copies available for a giveaway. So here's the way we're going to do this. In the link under this video, there is a contact page. Look for that link, contact, that comes to me. And leave me a message on the contact page that you would like a copy of Comparison Girl. Now, we don't know how many people we have who are going to be requesting this, so I really can't tell you your chances of winning a copy, but I am grateful we are giving a giveaway. And then check the links to Shannon's website, social media, all that good stuff under this video. Connect with Shannon. She lives this out. And she is passionate about helping other people live out the story of Jesus in their own lives. And I know connecting with her and her resources will really be a blessing to you. And I am continuing to remind myself that all I am responsible for is to pour out what God has given me. I don't have to scrounge around to kind of fill up more, and I don't have to compare myself with what anybody else has. All I'm responsible for is gratefully receiving what God brings me and faithfully pouring it out. And I pray you do the same. Until next time, God bless you.